So there's increasing interest in economics about the role that mental health plays in shaping economic outcomes across life, and particularly the role that mental health plays as it evolves between childhood and adolescence. So in this paper we looked at a series of large data sets in the UK to look at the impact of childhood mental health and adolescent mental health on labour market outcomes. So in particular the extent to which the person was unemployed in their early adulthood, and then the extent to which that changed during a major recession. We wanted to see whether during a recession early vulnerabilities were particularly exposed. These are large samples of the UK population that have been collected since the 1950s, so they're called the child cohort studies, and in particular we looked at a group of children that were born in 1958 and tracked them all the way through the 60s and 70s using that data set. They were originally collected for different purposes, but now they've been opened up to researchers to look at a whole wide range of things, including economic outcomes. So we looked at childhood psychological distress measured when they were 7 and 10, and then how that predicted unemployment when they were in their 20s, in the late 70s and 80s. And we found very strong effects of childhood mental health controlling for a whole range of factors on unemployment, and in particular when the early 80s recession hit, we saw the gap between children who had poor mental health and those that didn't opened up substantially. And then we also looked at a later cohort, so people that were surveyed in the 90s and in the 2000s, and found very similar effects. So for children that had a marker of early childhood or adolescent psychological distress, they tended to be 2 to 3 percentage points higher in terms of unemployment. So if you imagine the overall rate was something like 2 to 3% unemployment, these kids would have had 4 to 5 to 6% unemployment in the years where we were studying, so very, very sizable effects. So there's a fascinating and long-running literature wondering why it is that unemployment is so aversive, for example. So there's a long literature looking at mental health effects that result from people being laid off, redundancies, etc., and maybe 30 years of trying to understand that and documenting that the effects are really sizable. So what we had started to do, including in my early papers, is started to ask, well, what about the other side? Is it the case that as well as unemployment being bad for mental health, what does poor mental health in general do to one's unemployment probabilities? And basically it's a sort of two-way interaction, in the sense that poor mental health leads to potentially more vulnerable labour market outcomes, but also being laid off and being long-term unemployed is bad for mental health. So I think what the literature is really trying to do now is look at the sort of two-way interaction between between unemployment and other economic outcomes and mental health outcomes, and trying to see where are the optimum points to intervene with public policy in terms of improving human welfare, and maybe of any area where public policy might matter. I think that the effects in this area are really sizable. I think one really interesting thing about this research was we went back and got what are called job spell data from this study, which allowed us to look at whether the person was employed or unemployed each month across their late adolescence right into their adulthood. And that allowed us to look, for example, at what happened right at the time when the recession kicked in, to see whether children that had early vulnerability were having a different reaction just as the recession kicked in compared to other children. And we've since shown this in the US also, and there's now other papers in Sweden showing a similar effect, that you get this sort of opening up of gaps. It's a fascinating, and I think we are one of the first papers really to point to this potentially very interesting interaction between mental health and macroeconomics, which is not just that the macroeconomy impacts mental health, but it will also impact disproportionately on folks that had poor mental health going in. So you get these really, really interesting sort of interactions between macroeconomics and mental health, which is broadly interesting from the point of view of the interaction between psychology and economics and what public policymakers can do in these types of things.